What if I told you that rhythm games weren't really a thing seriously until like 2005? Well into video game history, if you will. Specifically ones that focused on mimicking musical tracks or notes and even allowed you to play with plastic instruments meant to simulate real ones that you could use as a controller. And behind this entire revolution, especially in the West, was none other than Harmonix. That's because they would create both Guitar Hero and Rock Band, the two premier titles in the genre. Despite just two major franchises, these two would pump out like 24 different games between the two of them over the span of 10 years or less, creating multi-billion-dollar industries in the process. But by 2016 through 2017, rhythm games no longer were dominating the gaming space, and following two rather lackluster releases for the Rock Band franchise, they suddenly would disappear altogether, the world having not seen a new one in nearly 10 years now. As of 2026, Rock Band hasn't even dropped a DLC in quite some time. Instead, Harmonix changed hands a few times as a company and now resides with Epic Games, where they currently are working on Fortnite Festival, or at least what's left of Harmonix is, similar to a Rock Band game, but more of like the live service always online approach to it. Oh, have the mighty have fallen, and that's why this is a special episode of the Death of the Game Show, Detectives, a series where we investigate the largest contributing factors to a game, company, or in this case, series' death, or process of dying by utilizing a timeline of events filled with clues, player and developer testimonies, and most important of all, detective intuition. Harmonix might have created the rhythm gaming industry themselves, but they also had a very large hand in its ultimate, as of now, demise. Something we will make sure to analyze properly, and in order to do that, we're going to be analyzing all Rock Band games. Yep, you heard that right. All Rock Band games will be covered in this video, including the band-specific games, LEGO spinoffs, and even mobile titles. So detectives, choose your instrument, song of choice, and difficulty level, and let's form a rock band! The story begins with the founding of Harmonix, a video game developer stationed in Boston, Massachusetts, formed by two MIT students, Alex Rogopoulos and Iran Agosi. These two were students of music, or related fields, and both played instruments, a key in what would come next, which was their seemingly lifelong pursuit of converting these skills and interests into gaming, with the idea that performing music could become accessible to those without much music knowledge or experience, something that basically didn't exist in the Western market. So they went to Japan, to the East, to learn from the source at the time. Harmonix as a company would first find success in different sorts of technologies. These were technologies they could sell to theme parks. Harmonix would, after their trip to Japan though, attempt to sell their technology there as well, but realized that they would find little success with that product. But in the process, figure out and observe why music video gaming was so popular in Japan, with things like karaoke bars, Dance Dance Revolution, Parappa the Rapper, and even Beatmania. These games were all about personal expression, as they incentivized players to recreate the music through their actions, and made music approachable in a gaming format for gamers. Agosi and Rogopoulos would return to the US with tons of insight and a new idea in hand, but to accomplish this, they would need to let go of like 40% of their current staff and regroup as a company first. Their first rhythm game was not what you might have expected, though it might look similar to many indie titles that have since launched, like Audiosurf, one that I played. Frequency, which launched in November 20th, 2001, was a rhythm game for the PlayStation 2 that featured a virtual avatar, or freak, that would travel down a tunnel with each wall containing a musical track, followed by sequences of notes that you must hit the correct corresponding buttons for. This probably sounds awfully similar to later musical games, including ones with the instruments. Actually, Harmonix would originally try to pitch the game to Microsoft, but were told by the former vice president of publishing at Fries, I just didn't want to sound like I was like really hungry, that they needed a custom hardware controller to make a game of that style properly work, which were quite prophetic words. Frequency wasn't quite the hit Harmonix had wanted it to be, but was enough of one, as it got more eyes on them as a developer, that they would follow it up with a sequel, Amplitude, March 25th, 2003. Funded by Sony this time, Amplitude was a sequel that took lessons from the first game and tried to make it more enjoyable as an experience overall, now utilizing a more spread out track that felt less claustrophobic since it wasn't the tunnel anymore and was easier to read the instrument spread with. However, you have to consider, even if these games were way ahead of their time, sometimes being way ahead of your time is not the best for business or long-term success. Being a pioneer, simply put, doesn't always pay off. Harmonix was paving the way, the hard way. At the time, most popular media was still print media. Musical games or genres didn't quite translate well there, to be honest. Hey detectives, if you're watching this video and not currently subscribed to the channel, make sure to do that. Also, if you're not a member of the channel or a member of our Patreon, please consider supporting the channel further there. We can't and choose not to rely entirely on ad revenue, as it dictates the kind of content we have to make too much. Because of this, any and all support elsewhere is greatly appreciated, including things like super thanks and super chats. Without this kind of support and the sponsors we take on the channel, we simply wouldn't be able to further create content at our current scale as it stands. So your help is much appreciated, as it's keeping the lights on both in my house and at my operation here, nerdSlayer Studios. But that was a quick ad break. Back to the case, detectives. Harmonix's big break would come in 2003, when they were approached by a Japanese developer/publisher giant Konami to create the Karaoke Revolution franchise. Konami already had something similar with Bomani in Japan, but wanted the US market open as well, and needed a partner. This success for Harmonix would position them greatly, as now they had worked on some seriously mainstream music, improving their marketability and overall ceiling. It also, of course, gave them the experience to later work with microphones. Sony would choose to work with Harmonix again, this time concerning a new PlayStation 2 game that would require a camera, the iToy, an official peripheral, for players to perform themselves as a controller in a futuristic sports game. This would drop November 2004. This game is honestly a hilarious invention in its peak 2000s, but far ahead of its time, and maybe not for the best. Still, it sold extremely well compared to previous titles, but Rogopoulos and Higoshi were artists at heart, and they weren't happy with the game just selling well. This made their overall prospects, or feelings of their prospects of the genre, lower in the process. But things would change in a major way when Harmonix would team up with publisher and hardware peripheral manufacturing company Red Octane. This partnership would revolutionize the history of musical video games and players' expectations with them, modeling their design in likely more ways than just hardware, let's be honest, after a popular video game series in Japan known as Guitar Freaks and, well, Drummania, since they had both of them, which launched as far back as like 6 years prior, and actually still exists as of today in the form of like more arcade-style gaming. This partnership and heavy Japanese inspiration would lead to the first major rhythm game utilizing plastic instruments in the West, Guitar Hero 1. Now, some of you keen detectives might be confused as to why I'm covering Guitar Hero, beside it, well, being Harmonix. But since Harmonix was behind both Rock Band and Guitar Hero came first. It's still relevant enough to cover, even just briefly for the historical context. But Guitar Hero was a smash hit that would receive universal acclaim, managing to hit 91 out of 100 from 65 different critics, nothing short of amazing for a pioneer in its class. It would sell 1.53 million copies and end up spawning what would later become a billion-dollar franchise despite the humble beginnings. Guitar Hero would feature cover tracks to save money too, such as Black Sabbath's Iron Man, Motorhead's Ace of Spades, and More Than a Feeling from Boston. Honestly, 3 great hits that I know from memory from Guitar Hero, and many more hits that would become synonymous with the series and gaming. The gameplay in Guitar Hero is simple. You start off picking your avatar or character and are assigned to do various forms of gigs that grow as you become more successful on your journey to become a rock superstar, unlocking more challenging songs in the process. If you played well enough, you could unlock the extra encore song after a gig, allowing you to make even more money and score so you can buy better equipment. The career mode was connected to multiplayer too, in a sense, that you needed to play it to unlock all of the music, which was a great aspect of it. Guitar Hero, as the name implied, only featured the guitar initially, which you would have to purchase alongside the game or in a combination deal to play the game. Now, while you could play the game with a regular controller, it felt nothing like playing with the plastic Gibson SG controller, which allowed you to press 5 different colors in a simulated game fashion, while being able to strum the bar and use the whammy stick or turn your guitar up for star power moments or solos later on. I was enthralled by this simple concept as a kid, never having the opportunity nor skill to pick up an actual guitar, but loving video games based on rhythm, and the idea of learning to play a video game guitar for fun. And I wasn't the only kid like that, with Guitar Hero becoming a name almost all gamers, whether they liked music games or not, were familiar with. After this massive success, Viacom, specifically through their MTV networks, would acquire Harmonix Music Systems Incorporated, the full name of Harmonix, for $175 million in a stock purchase, in an effort to expand their music-based offerings in the realm of gaming entertainment. This would rather end up being a major event, because Viacom through MTV Games would later publish the subsequent titles, after they put out their next contractually obligated games through Red Octane, who had just recently got acquired, at the time, by Activision. According to Bobby Kotick later on, the CEO of Activision for a time, they would regret not also purchasing Harmonix. Harmonix would follow Guitar Hero up with another sequel, one that would be an upgrade in just about every way and is easily my favorite Guitar Hero game, Guitar Hero 2. The home of my favorite metal band's banger master track, Hangar 18. Anyway, dropped just a year after the first. Guitar Hero 2 would greatly expand the track list, nearly doubling it, and also add both the bass guitar and rhythm guitar options too, so you don't have to play the same notes in co-op or in verses. Some of my favorite upgrades were the practice mode, allowing you to slow down segments and turn on Never Fail. This really completely would change the landscape of the game, because it made mastering tracks and high score chasing a thing that still dominates the rhythm game genre today. The formula of Guitar Hero 2 was the same as before, just better in every way, managing to sell nearly double at 3.1 million units, incredible for 2006. To fulfill their final contractual obligations though, Harmonix would put out a bit of a spin-off Guitar Hero game, Encore, Rocks the 80s, July 24th, 2007. I call it a spin-off because it's not really a full sequel. It had a very small and very restricted to the age track list, and it didn't innovate or expand the game in any serious way. The reviews and sales for the game reflect this, as it would score the lowest in the series historically at just 69 out of 100 on Metacritic from like 50 different critics. But this is when things would fork in the road. Harmonix was done with their contract, and their new owner and publisher was wanting and expecting to publish their games now. Guitar Hero wouldn't die as a series either, however, especially with how massively successful it had become. Instead, it would be handed to Neversoft, up until they would pivot the franchise after a poor reception with Guitar Hero Warriors of Rock to Vicarious Visions, which I forgot even existed. And Harmonix, of course, would move on to make the next major music video game series, one that would become Minnie's favorite due to its major innovations, such as my favorite. Harmonix wanted to branch out to more than just guitars and basses. They already had experience with vocals, with their Karaoke Revolution series, so that would be a no-brainer. But they would go a step further than that and now introduce a brand new 4-pad drum set with a kick pedal and sticks, introducing percussion to the game for the first time. Harmonix would unveil this in their new premiere series Rock Band, which would drop November 20th, 2007, and was my first entry into the series. Rock Band was the first game I got that I had my whole family wanting to play alongside with me, and that was really the magic about the game. It brought a band to your living room in a more accessible and fun, arguably, video game sense. Rock Band would score the same as Guitar Hero 2, but on a grander stage now, at 92 out of 100 from 72 different critics on Metacritic. The game would also manage to sell a whopping 4 million copies, and nearly more than the previous mainline Guitar Hero games combined. Who knows how many of those games were just game sales either, or like the big Rock Band full set that also included the game, which was like a whopping $170 USD, which sucked because you still had to purchase another guitar, though people like me still had their previous guitar from Guitar Hero, which helped. Rock Band's career mode was a total upgrade though, allowing you to play the campaign with other players locally and later online. The tour process was more customizable and allowed for payoffs in the way of sponsor deals and managing your budget. You could also customize your avatar with the character creation tool. The track lists between the games were fairly comparable at launch, but Rock Band pretty much invented the weekly/monthly song release DLC system to the genre, which Guitar Hero 2 couldn't really do due to the old hardware. There was nothing like Rock Band, guys. Seriously. A full evolution of the musical video game genre. Playing with your friends locally and hoping your bandmates can pull through at key moments as you had to, as a band collectively, to progress through songs. Guitar Hero was like the premiere model, and Rock Band was like the full expansion and execution of that idea, done by the same developers too. While Neversoft with the Guitar Hero series would put out tons more titles after Harmonix would move on, none of theirs would ever eclipse the prior developers' first two titles. Rock Band 2 would drop September 14th, 2008, and this is where I have to mention that Harmonix was a part of this insane release schedule. A release schedule that seemed almost untenable even for ball and gun gamers, a far more numerous gamer amount, releasing essentially a new rhythm game every year. But Rock Band 2 was like Guitar Hero 2, a direct upgrade, increasing the track list and replacing the cover tracks with actual master tracks, being able to even use the old DLC on the new game too, and allowing for World Tour progress online. The controllers themselves were also upgraded, with the drum pedal being upgraded to metal, which is funny because mine broke because it was plastic, and the strum bar being reduced in sound. A personal note though, although this did reduce the sound, part of what makes Guitar Hero's controllers, like the early ones at least, so good is that they were super loud and had strong button pushes. Rock Band went for more of like a softer, more tactile design, including granting like a solo bar, which has a new set of notes that you could play without strumming, though this was kind of like made obsolete with changes to how solos worked later on. Rock Band 2 would score an impressive 92 out of 100 from 69 different critics, and once again would reach universal acclaim as a crucial title for the platforms that it would reach, making that like the 4th game in a row that Harmonix had reached universal acclaim with. But by the 2nd game in the Rock Band series, the franchise had already eclipsed an impressive 1 billion in retail sales alone. Harmonix didn't just create a competitor to Guitar Hero, they created the competitor, Rock Band. But much like the Guitar Hero franchise would hit the ground and keep running, Rock Band was no different, releasing their first spin-off PSP port, Rock Band Unplugged, June 2009, a title that I remember because it had Everlong from Foo Fighters on it, which was a really fun track. This title barely would score a 79 out of 100 though, as it would not even have an online mode, a crucial feature to Rock Band at that point. And worse, it barely had like 41 bass tracks, which was like the lowest in the series yet. But just when I thought they weren't only adding a new rhythm game every year, or now a new Rock Band game every year, they would smash that expectation in 2009 and would drop as many as 4 Rock Band titles, starting with the unplugged PSP version I mentioned, and following that up with the first special themed band game, The Beatles Rock Band, which dropped September 9th, 2009. Despite what it sounds like and kind of how I pitched it, this game actually did quite well, as it didn't just rely on the fact that it was, it had the Beatles name to carry it. It actually added innovations, such as vocal harmonies with groups allowing up to 3 players to sing at once. The career mode plays out like a virtual museum recounting the most important events and venues in the Beatles' history too. And the 45 tracks included might seem small, but were all carefully remastered. The cinematics and character scenes are well animated, and the Beatles Rock Band really was a high point for the series, all things considered, from how it looked at first glance. Though it failed to sell as much as the first game, managing to sell over like 3 million copies reportedly was still insanely remarkable. But just 1 month later, and Rock Band would launch on mobile devices October 19th, 2009, a market they would never quite make a mark at. It would be followed by another Rock Band mobile game as well, created by EA Montreal. But that wasn't it for the year. Another month and another Rock Band game would drop, this time a Lego Rock Band game that would drop November 3rd, 2009. This would barely manage to score a 71 out of 100 from 50 different critics, who even they considered the game to be a quite unnecessary cash grab that added nothing new or exciting. In fact, it removes some of the online features, has a small track list that features mostly like mainstream title hits, and the core gameplay is essentially just like a Rock Band game, not a Lego game in almost any way, shape, or form. Even the previous features of the Beatles version that were loved were now also missing. I want to give them credit and say that Harmonix probably didn't want to be the ones putting out these many titles, but considering they started making a rhythm game every year from the beginning, they likely created this expectations themselves, directly or indirectly, and that was probably also sold as a main strength of theirs as a company, the ability to factory produce another rhythm game year after year. But their overexposure would start quite early on, with their now turned competitor series Guitar Hero between the two, adding as many as like a dozen or more rhythm game titles over just the course of like 3 to 4 years. Printing money was just making them think they could keep printing it, and there was no ceiling, and nothing was gonna pop and nothing was gonna crash. Hell, even Harmonix was at the time bragging about how extensive their music library was and how easy it was to work with artists with how popular they would have become, not really acknowledging how expensive that licensing would be and continue to grow and grow. In many ways, they were moving too fast for their britches, as we say in the South. This is why following their Lego Rock Band release, they would lay off as many as 39 employees. Harmonix was able to sell nearly 3 million copies of their Beatles version of Rock Band, and wanted to attempt a similar idea again, this time with an American band popular at the time, though kind of more so in the years prior, Green Day, launching the Green Day Rock Band June 8th, 2010. This title would score an average of 75 out of 100 from 54 different critics, though being disliked mostly by the fanbase as they saw it as very derivative and not quite the hit that the Beatles version was due to the crossover popularity lacking in music catalog and just not having the same love and affection given to it as a game. But the failure of Green Day's Rock Band would be lessened in a sense, as they would drop the next major iteration in the Rock Band series the same year, and it was the best one yet. Released October 26, 2010, Rock Band 3 would go on to become the best-rated rhythm game on Metacritic ever, where it would score an impressive 93 out of 100 from 57 different critics. Rock Band 3 was a full innovative step forward for the series and genre itself, allowing players to now play a keyboard which featured a real MIDI-compatible keyboard, play with up to 7 local players in a band now, and the return of the 3-vocal harmony system. But unlike any other rhythm games, Rock Band 3 bridged the gap between rhythm games and real instrument playing the most yet, allowing players to use real instruments as controllers like the Squier Stratocaster or Fender Mustang. They even added the crash, ride, and hi-hat to the drums, making it even more realistic. The couch co-op was also a major hit in Rock Band 3, alongside the upgraded, less restrictive career mode, World Tour. Repeating the same thing that Rock Band 2 would do, Rock Band 3 would allow all the previous Rock Band DLC tracks to be played, which at this point was like well over 2,000 tracks, a number that would swell up to like double that overall. This was on top of its already impressive 83-song track list. Rock Band 3 was so successful, it even had a Nintendo DS version. Yeah, a handheld DS version that was actually one of my good friends' first experience playing Rock Band even. But despite this massive success, especially from the fanbase, Viacom wasn't happy with the game's sales, which wasn't surprising when the rhythm game market had become heavily oversaturated, with rhythm games as a whole decreasing as much as 50% in sales over the years. This would ultimately lead to the demise of MTV Games, who had previously published Rock Band up to that point. Viacom, sensing the trouble, would sell Harmonix to an investment company who likely was involved so Harmonix could afford to go independent. Sometime in December 2010, Viacom would make a boatload of money from the fire sale of sorts, and have all kinds of extras attached to it that would make them well over like 100 to 150 million allegedly. The crazy part was, the fire sales mentioned because they only sold the company for $50. This was because they had a boatload of debt inventory and debt accrued, and they needed to quickly offload it, including the musical rights that they were paying for. This might be one of the scummiest things I've heard. While Viacom, in typical corpo fashion, would try to argue they would pay out enough to Harmonix and the founders of it, who thought they were going to get some sort of like bonus deal from their performances, they would be taken to court by Harmonix and would ultimately lose the court case, which would cost them upwards of $600 million or more. Harmonix, through the fire and the flames, though, had finally gotten free. But free came with its own problems. Slight detour, but we need to cover the December 2nd, 2010 Rock Band mobile title, Reloaded. It was sold as having Rock Band on the go, but again, failed to catch flight with the player base. No matter how much Harmonix seemed to try to get away from using plastic peripherals as controllers, they seemed to define them. They just couldn't get away from them successfully. Those problems of being free would hit fast, when Harmonix would be forced to lay off as many as 15% of their staff, February 2011. Harmonix's success that kept them afloat at the time, as they were now independent, would be Dance Central, their own spin on the dance game craze that was blowing up even in the West at the time, led by titles such as Just Dance. But of course, the OG in the East, Dance Dance Revolution, and the mini spinoffs. Harmonix had nearly fully pivoted off of peripherals altogether, and even bundle sales, wanting to push more into the controller direction, which they would exhibit in the downloadable content game, Rock Band Blitz, which would drop in August of 2012. Blitz would fail to make much of a revolution there, ultimately though being taken off stores in like 2017 later on. But what it would do is set a further blueprint for Harmonix to rely on the base controller as the main controller for the series. But the money just wasn't quite there anymore, even with all the DLC track sales, and Harmonix would have to make some major changes after a few years. May 2014, they would swap their longtime CEO Alex Rogopoulos, one of the company's founders, with Steve Janiak, essentially brought in to be kind of like the business guy to run the business. That was the thing with Harmonix. At its core, it was an artist's company, but whether in gaming or music, artists can be exploited and forced to learn to adapt to business whether they want to or not, or find someone who can. Perhaps trying to get the right business guy involved in, things sooner could have helped things. But at this point, they were only independent for just a few years. It's not like they had a ton of time to figure things out. Harmonix wasn't done yet though, and they still had one major trick up their sleeve. And one major title promised for the Rock Band series, one that they would need to acquire $15 million in investment for to prepare for its release upcoming and post-launch support. Rock Band 4, the final Rock Band title in the series, well, at least as of 2026, would drop October 6th, 2015, and for the first time in a decade or more, Rock Band was unable to make waves, critically, or even with the player base, as the game would scrape by a 78 out of 100 from 51 different critics on Metacritic and be much worse received by the fanbase. Rock Band 4 was just bizarre, and maybe this is how it looked when nobody was cracking the whip at Harmonix, but the game would lack many of the series' most famous features, such as practice mode, the character creator, and drumroll, like Rock Band drumroll. It didn't even include multiplayer. Yeah, Rock Band 4 was so rushed to market, it didn't even include one of its crowning features, multiplayer. Worse, many of the legacy guitar controllers wouldn't even work with Rock Band 4, which would essentially mean it was forcing you to buy their expensive $250 bundle to buy the game, or their new controller. But Rock Band 4 wasn't the only rhythm game that flopped. Guitar Hero's live version, which was set to be a reboot of the series, also dropped the same year, and heavily flopped too. Both titles had failed to stay modern and keep innovating in ways that made sense, and they were kind of like the chickens coming home to roost. They were inherently designed around microtransactions as a series overall, of course, which created even more fatigue amongst the player base having to buy the subsequent ones. But worst of all, the reason for the decline of both Rock Band and Guitar Hero as franchises shares one major similarity: oversaturation. Guitar Hero produced 15 titles over 4 years and Rock Band another 10. That means 25 games in 4 years. That's nearly $1,250 in just base game cost, not counting the 4,000 or so other tracks you could purchase. Despite the friendliness and approachability of the series and the gameplay of it, they both were absolute money pits, and consumers just got tired of it, especially with the rise of mods or games such as like Clone Hero, Guitar Hero World Tour, DE or Deluxe Edition, a fan-made expansion, YARG, and later on Rock Band 3 Deluxe, which would all allow players to import their own playlists and songs. Had either series just stuck to one major game before trying to milk the ever-living fuck out of it, they probably could have transitioned to a more live service model that was sustainable, keeping them alive and the library all in one place. Guitar Hero tried to do this with Live, but without a good enough game and too little too late, it just wasn't enough. Rock Band 4 would be followed up by a major content released in the form of an expansion, titled Rivals, which would cost $30 and be released October 18, 2018, nearly 3 years after the game came out, finally introducing multiplayer to the game. Rivals had like this companion-like single-player story that played differently depending on your performances and like 44 new tracks. Now, if you think of Harmonix as like the indie developer underdog doing this sort of game, it's nothing short of impressive. But with their near 2-decade-long history and track record of making these sorts of games, people just had way higher expectations, and waiting 3 years to get multiplayer that still barely added anything new, short of like Cruise, was just not acceptable. Not only was Rock Band 4 bare bones, it just also looks low budget, which probably hurts it above all else in many ways. The next Rock Band game in the series would be the actual last, Rock Band VR, Virtual Reality, March 2017. This would be published and funded by Oculus Rift entirely, as the game would require an Oculus Touch controller to play, mounted to a Rock Band 4 controller, making it incredibly expensive. Now the sad thing is that Rock Band VR was such a massive flop it barely managed to sell less than 1,000 copies. Yes, 1,000. And it cost 8 figures to make, meaning that it was a bare minimum of $10 million, according to Oculus co-founder Palmer Luckey. This was a bummer, because although I won't say Rock Band VR was a top-tier title, it had some really interesting ideas, and instead of forcing you to adhere to a classic song note structure you must follow, you could free play, almost kind of like guitar karaoke. But although it featured the Rock Band name, the game was more like a Guitar Hero VR game, if anything, and not a very good one. Harmonix would seemingly abandon the idea of making more Rock Band games or even making them as an indie developer, instead choosing again to rely on the controller tech that they sort of patented, sometime in February 2020, where they would announce a new title, Fuser, a game similar to DJ Hero without the need of you to have a turntable, allowing you to mix your own tracks based on some of those provided. But although it actually was a pretty cool game in my opinion, the lack of marketing and expensive licensing made the game just have to be a hit. I mean, did I mention it was published by like NC Soft of all publishers? Wild. Harmonix's independent time was anything but impressive, with them failing to largely have produced a quality level title that they were known for. Their independence would change in November of 2021, where they would be purchased by Epic Games with the desire to have them create immersive music experiences. This was 2 years after Fortnite found massive success in the live concerts of sorts they were featuring, which had major musicians. Fuser's failure though, and lack of success from Rock Band 4 had forced Harmonix back into the corporate arms, but the bright side was they were being offered a lifeline potentially that one without, they wouldn't have made it. But in typical Epic Games fashion, instead of announcing anything positive first or having anything to say good, they immediately following the acquisition news would have news that would hit the web that they would be shutting down nearly all Rock Band games as online services, the only exception being the fourth game. A totally bizarre mood killer that did a whole lot to damage their reputation in the eye of the fans, as the new key holders to the franchise, and is a large reason that many fans would start to turn to other applications and games outside of Guitar Hero and the Rock Band bubbles too. But whether Epic Games didn't see the ROI anymore or just wanted to cancel their competition themselves, they would finally utilize Harmonix for something a few years later after their acquisition, and that was because Harmonix was finally cooking again. Unveiled December 9th, 2023, or technically earlier, when it was teased during the Fortnite Eminem concert, was Fortnite Festival. This game would initially launch with only controller support before patching in just about the majority of the rest of the instruments, though it would take another 3 years to receive pro vocals, aka like actual vocals. There was a daily rotation of songs, and besides that you would have to purchase songs with V-Bucks, for as much as like $5 USD per song, which was just insane. No campaign mode, no real co-op, and no offline song library or world tour mode just made the game feel like the ultimate piecemeal version of what was there before with Rock Band and even Guitar Hero, even after multiple updates. But I have to say, I was happy to see Harmonix making rhythm games again with instruments involved, especially with Turtle Beach at the time still making plastic instruments. Harmonix would make a rather shocking announcement though January 2024 regarding their DLC future, which they had been pumping out now for like a decade or more, which was that they would no longer be releasing any more going further, promising that RB1-4, or Rock Band 4, and Rivals would continue on normally however. This started to feel like Rock Band's time in the sun was coming to an end, and would have continued to feel like that if not for, once again, the savior of the day as it normally happens in my episodes, the gaming community, and in this case the rhythm gaming community. That's because Rock Band 3 Deluxe would drop the same month as that announcement, which I briefly would mention before. This mod would allow for a fully customizable experience, massive custom song limits, better HUD, and even custom characters. It is kind of the de facto Rock Band mod now. And check out the link in the description for more information or just visit rb3dx.milohacks.org. The real final death knell though for Rock Band would come October 2025 when Rock Band 4 would be delisted from stores, though it could still be accessed by those who already owned a copy of the game, with the server still up. They would remain up even at the time of this video, being the last of a dozen or so titles to have its online services remaining. My guess is that this is probably related to the licensing of the music, because since it wasn't really making the money anymore, they can't afford to keep having it as a license that they could sell, since music licensing concerning an actual game that would be in a live game you could purchase versus one that's already been brought offline would be different. But that means that in nearly 10 years we have yet to see a new Rock Band title, and nearly all but the fourth game's servers have been shut down altogether, with that game no longer even being purchasable anyway. A hard fall from grace for a series that found massive success, and was able to gross over $1 billion in global revenue. Though it must be stated, this was after hundreds of millions were spent over the game's lifespan to pay for the music licensing, which cuts up that pie pretty nicely. But in case you missed any of the clues along the way, why did Rock Band ultimately die as a series? The franchise was just overfarmed, lack of further innovation. Music rights and costs just ate the game up. The business acumen was kind of lacking at the top, the failure to adapt to modern times. In the end, we can probably safely say that the oversaturation part was the single biggest reason for the failure of the plastic instrument rhythm game market, as we still see rhythm games around and making money with dance games, arcade games, and more. And that's where this episode should teach an important lesson. When you're already up 20 points, that's why you end up putting in the benchwarmers. Because there's no point in going up 40, or even 50, past the fact that you just can't. Because let's say you push for that in a game, think of a sports analogy here guys, I know hard for gamers, but you suddenly injure yourself and are unable to perform like that again, making your over expenditure especially not worth it in the end. Bringing it back to video game business, your fans are also clients or product buyers, meaning you can only sell them the same game so many times before they start to catch on. Word to the wise, to future developers and hell, even people in life, know when to take your victory and celebrate and not overstay your welcome. The classic, know when to hold him, know when to fold him. Let me know in the comments below your thoughts on my Rock Band voice. Just kidding. Rock Band as a series and any reasons you think I missed for why it ultimately faltered. Until the next case, detectives, the case where we cover one of the most iconic video game franchises ever. For the first time.
Let's go!